This is an overview of the readings for the 9th topic in the course on Introduction to Language Documentation and Description. The topic is collaboration. Some of the main ideas covered in these readings are the recent emphasis on collaborative approaches in language documentation and description, some of the challenges that have been noted in implementing collaborative approaches, and the emphasis on interdisciplinary collaboration in language documentation. These are the readings that will be reviewed in this recording. The first 3 readings are on the topic of collaboration between a linguist and a speech community. The other 2 readings are on the topic of interdisciplinary collaboration in a language documentation project. The expected readings for this course are Grinevald 2003, primarily section 4.2, and C 2011. Grinevald 2003 is an article published in Language Documentation and Description. This article reflects on the relationship of the linguist with speakers of a language being studied. The paper from nearly 20 years ago gives an idea of how ideas about collaboration with speech communities have developed in the context of language documentation, starting with questions about the relationship between a linguist and the speakers they work with most directly. A particularly helpful section of this paper is section 4.2, where Grinevald summarizes work done by Cameron et al. On different ways to conceptualize fieldwork relationships in social science. Fieldwork on a language is the traditional approach to data gathering with the usual ethical standards applied, typically centered around the idea of doing no harm. Fieldwork for a speech community is research that aims to produce results that help advocate for a better social situation for the speakers of that language, for example, by destigmatizing their way of speaking. Fieldwork with a speech community is the participatory approach where speakers can take a more active role in the data collection process and have more insight and influence over what data is collected and how it is analyzed. Finally, fieldwork by a speech community involves academically trained members of the community carrying out research on their own initiative, applying the research toolkit according to their own priorities and concerns. In concluding that section, Grinevald writes, "There is no doubt that to the extent that conditions permit, it is in these last 2 frameworks, of with and by, that most documentation projects are to be conceived today, if or when the goal is comprehensiveness and quality of the data collected, reliability of the analysis, and sustainability of the documentation process." Akumbu 2020 is an article on community-based approaches to writing grammars, recently published in the Studies in African Languages and Cultures journal. Akumbu's paper addresses the question of what it looks like to write a grammatical description for a community's benefit, and assesses how well grammar writers have done in achieving the goal of grammars for native speakers in Cameroon. He conducted a survey of speakers of languages that have been the subject of a published grammar. The majority of respondents said that their language did not have a grammar published. One exceptional community was Akosi speakers, who seemed to be more aware of the grammar due to a public celebration that was organized when it was published. Of those who were aware that there was a grammar of their language, only about 10% had a copy, and those all said it was difficult to read. Furthermore, the interviews that were done revealed that many Cameroonians tend to emphasize learning English and French, and so do not necessarily see the value in a grammar of their own Cameroonian language. Akumbu proposes a community-based approach to grammar writing that is driven by the community and done with extensive community participation. But he also points out the many obstacles to this ideal, including the need for long-term financial support, community sensitization, both to the motivations for a grammar writing project and also to address any negative perceptions left behind by past researchers. Akumbu also advocates for providing financial support for community participants in grammar writing. In order for the grammar to be more accessible to the community, it should also be done in tandem with a literacy project. Akumbu writes, "The interests of a grammar writer should serve the people both now and in the future. The benefits of working on a language with the community and for the benefit of that community are enormous." Dobrin Schwarz published an article on collaboration in language documentation and conservation in 2016. They point out that there are many ways that attempts to implement collaborative approaches in linguistics run up against significant roadblocks. This is often because research contexts vary significantly, so methods don't necessarily transfer from one area to another, or because researchers have unrealistic expectations or not enough time to build collaborative relationships, or because collaboration is implemented with an oversimplified view of the speech community as a homogeneous, cooperative, and accessible group of people. While much of the recent literature presents collaboration as a research method, Dobrin and Schwarz argue that it is actually about personal and social relationships, and that the framing of collaboration as a research technique is driven by a felt need to legitimize this social focus in academic research. They advocate for the anthropological method of participant observation as an approach that allows linguistic researchers to reflect on the social aspect of their research, which may or may not lead to more involved collaboration with members of the speech community. In their conclusion, the authors write, "Whereas an ideal of collaborative best practices promotes an established set of features for ethical research, the anthropological method of participant observation offers a means for discovering what constitutes positive relations according to members of a host community, and hence gives fieldworkers a way to determine what practices will actually serve best in a given research situation." On the topic of interdisciplinary research, C has an article on biology in language documentation, published in Language Documentation and Conservation in 2011. This paper describes the documentation of traditional biological and ecological knowledge in the context of a project to document the Solega language of India. C argues that including traditional ecological knowledge in a language documentation project is both important and a natural fit because it is relevant to the daily life of speakers, it is relatively easy to elicit, and the elicitation of this knowledge can cover various genres, including natural conversations. It is also a topic that is often neglected. Including ecological knowledge in a language documentation project often starts with the lexicon, although it is important to go beyond simple glosses and to provide descriptive definitions, ideally with multiple photos of the object described. Beyond the lexicon, ecological knowledge also appears in descriptions of types of landscapes and how humans interact with them, and discussions of life cycles and seasons. Elements of the local ecology can also play a role in documenting items of spiritual significance to the language community. In his conclusion, C argues that by eliciting materials in the biological and ecological semantic domains, a documenter would be most likely to record linguistic form and content that is of value to researchers and community members alike. In another paper on interdisciplinary focus in language documentation, Burenhult writes about domain-driven documentation. Burenhult argues that only framing language documentation corpus around genres or communicative event types ends up limiting the scholarly use of the corpus to linguists only. Instead, linguists should include a domain-focused structure where the topic of the recordings are centered around a particular domain, such as plants and animals, astronomy, music, or food. Such a focus adds conceptual clarity for both researchers and participants. It can easily include a wide range of communicative events. It creates new opportunities for interdisciplinary studies, and it also allows researchers to focus on potentially endangered domains of knowledge and language use. The landscape or geophysical environment is a domain that is fundamental to human experience. It is also one that is highly variable, and so it is likely to capture variation in linguistic representations as well. The author describes 2 language documentation projects with a focus on the domain of landscape. He reports that the domain-driven focus made it relatively easy to elicit language data, which included conversations, narratives, origin myths, music, and ecological knowledge. These projects result in interdisciplinary studies in the areas of geography, ethnophysiography, landscape architecture, and environmental psychology. In the conclusion, Burenhult writes, I have argued here that domain-driven documentation is not only an acceptable way of doing language documentation, but in fact also a particularly efficient and rewarding method for meeting our documentary aims. It is culturally informed, it satisfies the requirements of comprehensive language documentation, it has the potential to produce significant scientific discoveries, and it can be of immediate interest to other disciplines. There are many further resources on these topics, including works that were done in a few handbooks on language documentation, such as Grinevald and Furby's 2010 Language Documentation Practice and Values, as well as Bischoff and Janney's 2018 Insights from Practices in Community-Based Research. And there have been 2 recent special editions of the Journal of Language Documentation and Conservation that came out this year, one focused on collaboration with members of a speech community, and the other focused on interdisciplinary aspects of language documentation.